I want you to close your eyes for just a second.
Oh, setting the mood early. I like it.
Right. Just think back to the absolute most emotionally wrecked, uh, cheering in the theater, out-of-body movie experience you have ever had in your entire life.
Wow, yeah. We all have that one memory.
You know the exact sensory memory I'm talking about, right? The lights are completely down.
Yeah.
The screen is projecting this massive glowing image. The bass from the theater speakers is literally, it's physically vibrating in your ribcage.
And you're just entirely locked in.
Exactly. You're watching the final moments of a story that you have invested years, maybe decades into. You're perched on the very edge of your seat. You probably have this absolute death grip on the armrest, and the rest of the world has just vanished.
You're completely transported.
Completely. And that feeling, that perfect transcendent cinematic conclusion, it's incredibly rare. I mean, most movies, honestly, fumble the ending.
Oh, absolutely. Landing the plane is the hardest part.
But when a film actually hits that stratospheric high, it alters your DNA as a viewer. It stays with you forever. And today, we are looking at two absolute cinematic titans that delivered exactly that kind of generational experience for millions upon millions of people.
We really are. It's a massive topic.
It is. We are staging the ultimate showdown of cinematic finales. In one corner, the crowning achievement of operatic high fantasy, The Lord of the Rings, The Return of the King.
A masterpiece.
And in the other corner, the mythic, redemption-fueled space opera that literally defined modern blockbuster culture, Star Wars, Return of the Jedi.
It is a genuinely staggering juxtaposition because, well, we're not just comparing two popular movies here. We are looking at two tectonic cultural events.
Yeah.
These films didn't just entertain people for a couple of hours. They permanently defined the cinematic expectations for entirely different generations of moviegoers.
100%. And for this deep dive, we've been pulling together an incredible array of critical analyses, retrospective essays, behind-the-scenes production histories, really putting these two cultural monoliths head-to-head.
Right, and our mission for this deep dive is to deconstruct the architectural strengths, the structural weaknesses, and the lasting legacy of these two films. We want to answer what, on the surface, feels like a totally impossible question.
Which is, which epic finale actually reigns supreme as the ultimate masterclass in concluding a saga?
Exactly.
Okay, let's unpack this.
Yeah.
Because treating this like the ultimate heavyweight title fight is genuinely the only way to do the sheer scale of these films justice.
It really is the only appropriate framing.
I'm so incredibly excited to dig into this with you, the listener.
Yeah.
Because whether you're a hardcore cinephile who, tracks the evolution of special effects and editing theory, or you're just someone who inherently appreciates a satisfying narrative, understanding exactly how these two specific movies managed to stick the landing is a masterclass in storytelling mechanics.
Yeah, the mechanics are what we really care about here.
Right. We aren't going to sit here and recount the plots.
Mm-hmm.
You know these movies. You know about the ring. You know about the lightsabers.
If you don't, you've probably clicked on the wrong deep dive.
Exactly. Instead, we're going to tear into the editing techniques, the thematic juxtaposition, the scoring, the emotional resonance, basically figure out the actual machinery behind what makes a finale truly great.
Exactly. We are going to explore the why and the how behind that massive cultural impact. Because, it's one thing to acknowledge that a movie made $1 billion or sold a lot of toys.
Right.
But it's another thing entirely to dissect why a highly specific narrative choice, say, a subverted hero's journey versus a traditional redemption arc, leaves an audience emotionally decimated in the best possible way.
Decimated is the perfect word.
What's fascinating here is that to truly understand their differences, we first have to acknowledge their profound structural commonalities. Both of these films are carrying the exact same, almost unbearable burden. They both have to conclude incredibly beloved, deeply scrutinized trilogies.
Yes. The psychological pressure on both of these productions must have been absolutely crushing. I mean, think about the logistics of landing a plane that massive, knowing the entire world is literally watching the runway.
It's terrifying from a creative standpoint.
And when you look at the thematic bedrock of both films, they hinge on these massive, universal, almost elemental concepts. We're talking about the agonizing weight of sacrifice. We're talking about the possibility of redemption for the irredeemable. And we're talking about the ultimate definitive fall of absolute evil. These aren't small, intimate kitchen sink dramas where a character is just trying to figure out their midlife crisis, right?
No, not at all.
These are world-shifting, apocalyptic stakes.
And yet, they achieved the identical rapturous audience reaction through vastly different cinematic philosophies. On one side, we have The Return of the King from 2003.
The king itself.
When we talk about high fantasy at its most operatic, we're talking about the legacy of J.R.R. Tolkien's Mythopoeia, the creation of a completely realized secondary world translated to the screen with a level of earnestness that the genre had never seen before.
Earnestness is key there.
Exactly. It's a story told on a canvas so unfathomably large it almost defies traditional narrative comprehension. And then on the other side, we have Return of the Jedi from 1983.
A completely different beast.
Completely. When we classify it as a space opera, we're referencing its roots in melodramatic, chivalric romance. It's Flash Gordon serials colliding with Akira Kurosawa's samurai films, using the mass, cold vacuum of space to tell a surprisingly warm, intimate story about a dysfunctional family.
I love that contrast. The earnest myth versus the family melodrama in space. But before we can even attempt to declare a winner in this heavyweight bout, we really need to isolate what makes each of these films a masterpiece in its own right. And because we're being objective where they actually stumble.
Because they both do stumble.
Right. Even towering cinematic achievements have structural flaws. So, let's journey over to Middle-earth first. Let's talk about The Return of the King. Our research points to this brilliant phrase that perfectly encapsulates Peter Jackson's approach. They call it cinematic maximalism done right.
Cinematic maximalism.
Jackson takes the final chapter of this epic and just hurls every conceivable cinematic tool at the screen.
It is the exact right terminology. To contextualize that for a moment, maximalism in art is the philosophy of more is more. It is the absolute antithesis of restraint.
Right, no holding back.
You see it in the sprawling historical epics of David Lean or Cecil B. DeMille. But the inherent danger, the trap of maximalism, is that it almost always collapses under its own weight into a chaotic, unreadable mess.
It's so easy to just become visual noise.
Exactly. But what is universally highlighted as the first major triumph of The Return of the King is its mastery of scale and spectacle. We really have to talk about the Battle of Pelennor Fields.
Oh, we have to.
This sequence isn't just a battle. It is an organizational miracle. The sheer magnitude of the armies, the introduction of the Mumakil, those massive elephant creatures, the crumbling architecture of Minas Tirith, it feels genuinely biblical.
Biblical's a heavy word, but you sit down and watch that charge of the Rohirrim, and there's no other word for it. The sun coming up over the ridge, the horns blow, it's insane.
It's overwhelming in the best way.
But let's look at how they achieve that, because it wasn't just throwing thousands of extras in a field in New Zealand. This is where Wodo Workshop's massive software comes into play, right?
A huge technological leap.
They literally had to invent new artificial intelligence programming so that tens of thousands of digital orcs and human soldiers could independently think, fight, and die on screen without an animator having to hand-draw every single sword swing.
Which was revolutionary for 2003.
Completely. But the genius, the done-right part of that maximalism is the editing. Imagine trying to visually manage that level of chaos. You have multiple armies clashing, the terrain itself is practically a character, and yet as a viewer, your eye always knows exactly where to look.
You never lose the geographic thread of the battle.
Exactly. It isn't just noise for the sake of noise.
That geographic clarity is paramount. But what truly anchors the maximalism is the thematic juxtaposition Jackson employs. The massive biblical scale of the Battle of Pelennor Fields only functions because it is cross-cut with the absolute inverse.
The intimacy.
Yes, extreme, agonizing intimacy. The research continuously pivots from the grand spectacle to the second major strength of the film, which is its profound emotional payoff. The macro conflict of the war is entirely subservient to the micro conflict happening on the slopes of Mount Doom.
Yes, Frodo and Sam's heartbreaking, physically degrading trek up that volcano. That is the true emotional core.
It grounds everything.
Jackson cuts from hundreds of thousands of digital creations slaughtering each other to extreme, suffocating close-ups of two actors covered in dirt, practically dying of dehydration, dragging themselves across rocks. If you don't care about those two small hobbits on that mountain, all the groundbreaking CGI and sweeping camera moves on the battlefield mean absolutely nothing.
It's an incredible balancing act.
And you look at the other arcs. Aragorn finally accepting the burden of his lineage, leading to that unforgettable coronation scene.
The bowing scene.
The line, "You bow to no one." I mean, I'm getting chills just referencing it right now. Every single thread planted hours and hours ago pays off perfectly.
And that meticulous payoff is exactly what led to the third strength we need to discuss, its unprecedented critical dominance. We often forget just how staggering the statistics are.
They're ridiculous.
The Return of the King won 11 Academy Awards. It tied the all-time record held by Ben-Hur in Titanic, winning every single category for which it was nominated.
11 for 11.
But if we connect this to the bigger picture of Hollywood history, this was a paradigm shift. This proved the film was not just a commercial juggernaut beloved by genre fans. It was fiercely validated by the most elite critical bodies in the industry.
Which was completely unheard of. Historically, the Academy has overwhelmingly favored grounded, historical, or contemporary dramas. The idea that a film featuring a giant demonic spider, an army of glowing green ghosts, and a flaming, disembodied eye on top of a tower could sweep the Oscars, including Best Picture and Best Director, was completely unthinkable before 2003.
It really was a snobbish industry before that.
It completely shattered the glass ceiling for fantasy films. It legitimized the entire genre in the eyes of the establishment. It proved that you could have wizards and magic and still deliver a narrative with undeniable technical and emotional mastery.
It was a watershed moment, undeniably. But as we promised the listener, we are not delivering a pure eulogy here. We have to examine the structural flaws.
Let's get into the flaws.
No film is immune to critique, and the discourse surrounding The Return of the King frequently points to a couple of distinct vulnerabilities, starting with the infamous multiple endings debate.
All the endings. The meme that absolutely never dies. People always joke that the movie has like 5 or 6 separate endings, and structurally you can see why people feel that way.
It defies conventional pacing.
Usually in a standard Hollywood screenplay, once the primary external conflict is resolved, the ring goes in the lava, Sauron's eye explodes, the tower falls. Traditional pacing dictates a very swift wrap-up. You get a 5-minute denouement and you roll the credits.
Wrap it up and send them home.
But Jackson refuses to do that. He methodically, painstakingly, closes out every single character arc. We get the Eagles rescuing them, the reunion in Rivendell, the coronation in Gondor, the return to the Shire, the scene of the Green Dragon, the writing of the book, and finally, the departure at the Grey Havens.
There's a lot of goodbyes.
For a lot of critics and audiences at the time, this felt like a massive overextension. It felt like a refusal to just cut to black.
I would actually push back slightly on framing that purely as a flaw, even though I fully acknowledge the structural drag it creates. The multiple endings are a direct reflection of Tolkien's source material, specifically his understanding of trauma.
That's a great point.
Jackson actually cut the Scouring the Shire, which was a massive sequence from the book where the hobbits have to fight a literal war at home, but he kept the thematic resonance of it through those extended endings. The film needed to show that you cannot go through an apocalyptic war and simply return to your old life unchanged.
You can't just go back to having pints at the pub.
Exactly. Frodo's prolonged goodbye is a deeply necessary acknowledgement of PTSD. However, strictly from a cinematic pacing standpoint, I do concede that after 3 hours of grueling narrative tension, asking the audience to sit through an additional 30 minutes of tearful goodbyes is a monumental ask.
I totally get the thematic necessity of it. It's like leaving a really profound, life-changing gathering. You say goodbye to the host, but then you run into an old friend in the hallway, and then you have a deep, crying conversation by the door, and suddenly it's an hour later and you're still emotionally discharging.
That's a very apt metaphor.
But that leads right into the second weakness that gets brought up in the sources, the heavy tonal solemnity. By the time we reach The Return of the King, the film has almost entirely shed the playful levity, the warmth, and the humor that made the Fellowship of the Ring so incredibly endearing.
Which is a consequence of the rising stakes. The closer they get to Mordor, the more the joy and camaraderie are literally choked out of the narrative. It is a grueling, oppressive, emotional experience.
It's bleak.
The maximalism we discussed earlier applies to the sorrow and the solemnity just as much as it applies to the spectacle of the battles. It is a heavy, heavy film to watch.
Yes, exactly. So Peter Jackson basically writes the definitive textbook on heavy, emotionally crushing biblical maximalism. But what happens when a filmmaker goes the entirely opposite route for their grand finale?
A complete 180.
What happens when you actively eschew the massive battlefield for the climax and instead focus on a claustrophobic, incredibly intimate, psychologically driven confrontation? That brings us to our other contender, Return of the Jedi.
Released in 1983.
Directed by Richard Marquand, though famously heavily guided by the creator George Lucas. This is the conclusion to the original Star Wars trilogy. It is the film that had to wrap up arguably the most influential saga in modern cinema history.
And when we analyze the architecture of what Return of the Jedi executes perfectly, the critical consensus immediately zeroes in on a very specific, iconic setting, the Emperor's throne room.
The Black Tower.
The climax of this film is frequently described as a psychological chess match between Luke Skywalker, Darth Vader, and Emperor Palpatine. This is considered by many film historians as one of the most perfectly constructed climaxes ever committed to celluloid.
It's brilliant.
And it is a profound contrast to The Return of the King. Instead of a sweeping, sun-drenched, open battlefield with hundreds of thousands of combatants, the true emotional core of this finale takes place in a confined, darkly lit, almost gothic room where three individuals are essentially just talking, manipulating, and ultimately clashing over the soul of one man.
I am obsessed with the phrase psychological chess match here because it is so incredibly accurate. Think about the choreography and the blocking of that scene. It isn't just about who has the flashier lightsaber skills or who can do a backflip.
No, it's not a prequel fight.
Right. Every swing of the blade, every pause, every line of dialogue is about ideology, temptation, and profound fear. You have the Emperor acting as this incredibly toxic manipulator, just trying to maneuver Luke into giving in to his anger and his hatred.
He's goading him.
You have Vader, who is completely torn, paralyzed between his servitude to his master and the latent love for his son. And then you have Luke, who is trying to thread this absolutely impossible needle. He has to defeat ultimate evil without becoming evil himself in the process.
The tension is incredible.
It's a masterclass. And the culmination of that chess match is the second major strength we need to highlight from the sources, Vader's redemption.
The cultural footprint of Vader's redemption is almost impossible to overstate. It fundamentally reshaped villain arcs for decades following its release.
It changed the blueprint.
If we connect this to the broader evolution of narrative history, the concept of the big bad, the terrifying, seemingly irredeemable enforcer of evil, suddenly experiencing a crisis of conscience and sacrificing himself out of familial love, was not the standard playbook for blockbusters in 1983.
Villains were just bad guys.
Exactly. Villains were supposed to be vanquished, usually by falling off a tall structure or being blown up. Return of the Jedi established an entirely new psychological template. It proved that an audience could find a much deeper, more profound satisfaction, not in the visceral destruction of the antagonist, but in their spiritual salvation.
It changed everything. And it flows perfectly into the next critical point. Emotional simplicity. And I mean, simplicity is a massive compliment here.
Oh, absolutely.
In a modern media landscape where we are constantly bombarded with incredibly complex, morally gray anti-heroes and cynical deconstructions of classic tropes, there is something incredibly potent about a story that strips all of that away. The core message of Return of the Jedi is remarkably clear direct. Compassion, hope, and the undeniable bond of family matter more than absolute power.
It's a beautiful message.
Luke literally throws his weapon away in the face of death. He wins by refusing to fight. That is an incredibly radical message for a massive action blockbuster.
It is the definition of mythic.
Yeah.
That is why the term mythic spectacle is so appropriate. Myths, at their core, are designed to be simple, universal truths packaged within grand, fantastical narratives. And the cultural impact of delivering that simple truth at that specific moment in history cannot be overstated.
It was a moment in time.
Return of the Jedi didn't just conclude a story. It completed a cultural phenomenon. It functioned as a true, synchronized generational event. It transcended the medium of film and became a shared global experience. It dictated how movies would be marketed, how merchandise would be integrated into the narrative, and how audiences engaged with ongoing franchises.
But just like with our journey into Middle-earth, we have to look at the dark side of the moon here. We have to talk about the flaws, and there are three very specific, highly debated weaknesses structurally built into Return of the Jedi. First up, and I know you know exactly where I'm going with this.
I do.
The Ewok tonal whiplash. Oh boy. This is the cinematic debate that has raged for 40 years.
It never ends.
You have this incredibly intense, dark, Shakespearean psychological chess match happening in the throne room. Luke is screaming, the Emperor is shooting lightning, and then the film dramatically cross-cuts down to the forest moon of Endor, where literal knee-high teddy bears are defeating an advanced, mechanized, fascistic galactic empire using logs, rocks, and strategically placed vines.
It is quite a contrast.
It is, well, it's a choice.
It is the defining structural vulnerability of the film. The phrase tonal whiplash perfectly captures the jarring, almost hallucinatory effect of intercutting the grave operatic drama of Luke, Vader, and the Emperor with the slapstick comedy and comparatively lighter action of the Ewoks.
It's really bizarre when you step back and think about it.
However, I will offer a defense of the intention, if not the execution. George Lucas was very heavily influenced by the Vietnam War. His original intention was for the technologically superior empire to be brought down by a primitive indigenous force using guerrilla tactics.
Okay, that makes sense on paper.
Originally, that was going to be the Wookiees. But because Chewbacca had been established as technologically proficient, he flies the Millennium Falcon and repairs hyperdrives, Lucas felt he needed a more primitive species. Hence, the Ewoks.
Wow.
The thematic intention nature defeating the unnatural machine is sound, but the execution undeniably fractures the tone of the climax.
That is such a fascinating piece of context about the Wookiees. You can totally see how a giant, terrifying Wookiee army tearing stormtroopers apart limb from limb would have matched the dark, intense tone of the throne room so much better.
It would have been a very different movie.
But you're right, seeing an Ewok hit a fully armored soldier with a rock and having the soldier fall over unconscious just completely undercuts the life or death stakes happening in orbit. And that leads directly into the second structural critique, the highly repetitive concept of a second Death Star. From a purely narrative screenwriting standpoint, returning to the exact same super weapon threat that drove the plot of the very first film feels like a massive lack of imaginative progression.
It is a profound failure of imagination on a macro level. The Death Star was the terrifying catalyst of the original 1977 film. To bring the entire saga to a close by simply introducing a larger, partially constructed version of the exact same threat significantly diminishes the narrative stakes.
It's just a bigger ball.
It feels incredibly safe. It is a retread. And because the film is reliant on this retread, it introduces a third weakness, significant pacing unevenness in the middle act.
Right, because you're retreading familiar ground with the Death Star, and you have to spend a massive chunk of screen time on Endor, introducing the Ewoks, learning their culture, and making them part of the rebellion. The momentum of the story naturally dragged.
It's stalled out.
The first act at Jabba's palace is this incredible kinetic heist. The third act is a three-pronged climax. But that middle act in the forest just meanders before it finally accelerates.
Precisely. The narrative tension slackens significantly. So to summarize our current position, we have two remarkably different cinematic achievements. Both are towering historic successes, but they possess distinct structural, tonal, and pacing vulnerabilities.
Here's where it gets really interesting. We have our two fighter stats, we know their profound strengths, and we've picked apart their weaknesses. Now we are going to actually put them in the ring together and compare them head-to-head across 4 specific, highly contested categories.
Let's do it.
Round 1. Storytelling complexity.
Let us examine the parameters of this specific comparison. We are evaluating the narrative density and the structural engineering of both films. The Return of the King is juggling an absolutely immense amount of material.
An unbelievable amount.
Think about the cross-cutting editing required here. It has multiple distinct armies. It has several converging plot lines operating simultaneously in completely different geographic locations. You have Frodo and Sam in Mordor, Aragorn on the Paths of the Dead, Merry and Pippin separated in different kingdoms.
It's a logistical nightmare.
And crucially, it is deeply steeped in thousands of years of mythological history that actively informs the characters' current decisions. The viewer is required to mentally map and keep track of a vast, interconnected web of events and lore.
Exactly. It asks a lot of the audience's cognitive load. Whereas Return of the Jedi, despite taking place across an entire galaxy, is structurally much simpler. Once the initial rescue mission at Jabba's Palace is resolved, the entire narrative basically boils down to a single, localized conflict.
A very straightforward mission.
Get the shield down on the forest moon, blow up the station in space, and confront the boss in the throne room. It is incredibly streamlined. It is completely focused on forward momentum.
Yes.
Because of that stark difference in architectural ambition, there is a clear winner for this round. The Return of the King definitively takes the crown for scope, scale, and narrative density. If you want a story that feels like a massive, sprawling, historically weighty tapestry, Peter Jackson's epic is the undisputed victor.
However, the second category of comparison emotional weight is far more subjective, deeply psychological, and incredibly complex. This is where the debate becomes truly granular.
This is the hard one.
This category pits two entirely different emotional catalysts, two vastly different interpretations of the hero's journey, against each other. On one side, we have Frodo feeling at the very edge of the precipice inside Mount Doom. This is frequently described as a devastating subversion and a tragic sacrifice.
It really is.
On the other side, we have Darth Vader saving Luke Skywalker, which is universally hailed as legendary and the ultimate narrative of redemption.
This is such an incredible fundamental contrast in how to end a story. I really want to dwell on this. Think about Frodo. Frodo is our pure, resilient, morally incorruptible hero. He endures horrific physical and mental torture to get all the way to the finish line. He is standing at the edge of the fire, the music swells, and then he fails.
The ring takes him.
He claims the ring for himself. The ultimate evil actually wins the psychological battle. The ring completely corrupts him in the final second, and it's only through a chaotic, desperate, violent accident with Gollum that the ring is actually destroyed. We use the word devastating because it is a total brutal subversion of the traditional hero's journey.
It's an anticlimax in the psychological sense.
Exactly.
Look.
Frodo doesn't get to be the triumphant, fist-pumping hero who overcomes his internal demons. His mind, his innocence, and his spirit are the tragic sacrifice required to save the world. He saves Middle-earth, but not for himself.
That is an incredibly poignant articulation of the tragedy. Frodo's failure is a profound, almost theological acknowledgement of the limits of mortal endurance against absolute corrupting power. The ultimate takeaway from Tolkien, which Jackson perfectly captures, is that absolute power cannot be defeated by sheer willpower alone.
You can't just muscle through it.
Exactly. It requires grace, pity, and the cumulative weight of small, seemingly insignificant acts of mercy. Specifically, the repeated choice to spare Gollum's life earlier in the narrative. It is deeply, fundamentally painful to watch. Conversely, Vader saving Luke is the exact opposite.
The total reverse.
It is the ultimate fulfillment of the hero's journey, but audaciously applied to the story's primary villain. It is the active, conscious choice of love over power. The narrative explicitly frames this as a choice for the viewer. Does a story resonate more deeply with you when it acknowledges the tragic breaking point of the human spirit, or when it affirms the soaring, unbreakable power of redemption?
So it really comes down to what makes you, the listener, feel more deeply in your core. Are you the kind of person who is moved to tears by the beautiful, heart-wrenching reality of a sacrifice that permanently breaks the hero? Or do you want that soaring, cathartic, jump-out-of-your-seat triumph of a lost, corrupted soul finding their way back to the light at the very last possible second?
It's a matter of emotional preference.
It's a really tough call. But in terms of sheer cinematic history, our sources give a slight edge to Return of the Jedi in the emotional weight category. The argument is that Vader's turn, executed almost entirely through body language under a static, emotionless mask, is arguably one of cinema's most powerful, iconic character pivots.
I agree with that assessment when you consider the longevity and the universal legibility of the imprint. The sudden shift from terror to deep parental empathy in a single silent character action is a profoundly difficult maneuver to pull off.
Especially with a plastic mask on.
Exactly. It relies entirely on John Williams' score, shifting the Imperial March into a tragic minor key elegy, and the editing. Its execution in Jedi remains an absolute touchstone for screenwriters trying to map out a redemption arc. Which brings us seamlessly to the third category of our head-to-head comparison action sequences.
Round 3. This is where the visual spectacles, the sheer kinetic energy of the filmmaking go head-to-head. We are looking at the sweeping daylight carnage of the Battle of Pelennor Fields versus the chaotic, three-tiered editing of the Battle of Endor.
Space, forest, and throne room.
Right. We're comparing the desperate physical struggle at Mount Doom versus the elegant, emotionally charged lightsaber duel in the throne room. And the distinction here is very clearly defined. The Return of the King is entirely about delivering overwhelming, practically unfathomable physical spectacle. Return of the Jedi is about delivering intimate, highly choreographed, mythic confrontation.
And because of that massive split in cinematic intent, we actually have to split the verdict for this category. A structural tie, yes. For pure cinematic scale, for the sheer logistics of moving thousands of digital and physical bodies across a frame in a way that remains visually coherent and thrilling, The Return of the King is the undisputed winner. It is the apex of conveying mass, momentum, and physical stakes on screen. What a digital changed the industry with those battle scenes.
They wrote the code for modern CGI.
But for a character-driven climax where the action is entirely subservient to the internal psychology of the participants, Return of the Jedi takes the win. The clash of lightsabers in the throne room is merely the physical manifestation of the ideological battle happening between Luke and the Emperor. Every strike of the blade is a sentence in their argument.
I think that is a really smart, equitable way to judge it. You can't realistically compare a laser sword fight between an old man, a young man, and a cyborg in a dark room to a daytime battle involving thousands of horsemen charging at giant mutated elephant monsters.
It's apples and oranges.
They're using completely different cinematic languages to achieve completely different emotional goals. Which leads us to the final and perhaps the most fascinating head-to-head category we have today: cultural legacy.
This raises an important question, and it is one that film historians debate endlessly. How do we accurately evaluate legacy?
Right, how do you measure that?
Are we judging by box office receipts, critical awards, or the fundamental alteration of the industry itself? We have two distinct forms of cultural impact here. Return of the Jedi is widely recognized as helping to fully define modern blockbuster culture. It is the cultural originator.
Blueprint.
The assertion here is that without Jedi successfully closing out the trilogy and proving that audiences will return for serialized, massive budget storytelling, modern franchise filmmaking simply does not exist. It solidified the model of the merchandise-driven, globally synchronized cinematic event. It proved that toys, cross-promotion, and extended universe media were not just ancillary products, but core components of the blockbuster machine.
It essentially wrote the entire rulebook for what a massive multimedia movie franchise could be. Marvel, DC, modern Star Wars, they're all just playing by the rules that Jedi codified in 1983.
They're all walking in its footsteps.
But then you look at The Return of the King, which operates on a completely different axis of legacy. It is referred to as the genre elevator. The argument is that this film completely, single-handedly redefined what fantasy adaptations could achieve in the eyes of both the public and the critical establishment.
It brought prestige to fantasy.
Without The Return of the King proving that high fantasy could be deeply emotional, critically acclaimed art, studios might never have invested hundreds of millions of dollars into prestige fantasy ever again. We probably don't get Game of Thrones without Peter Jackson proving it could be done. He took a genre that was often dismissed as niche, silly, or purely for children, and proved it could stand alongside historical epics as high art.
Cultural originator versus genre elevator. It is a profound dichotomy. Is it more historically impressive to be the architect who pours the concrete foundation of an entirely new era of commercial filmmaking, or the master artisan who takes an existing, overlooked genre and elevates it to its absolute zenith, validating it for all time?
That's a great way to frame it.
Return of the Jedi demonstrated the absolute commercial and cultural ceiling of what a franchise finale could achieve in the zeitgeist. The Return of the King demonstrated the absolute critical and artistic ceiling of what a massive fantasy epic could be.
It's like Jedi created the very language of the modern blockbuster, and The Return of the King used that exact language to write a masterpiece that won 11 Oscars. So with all these rounds fought, with the editing, the themes, and the legacy all laid bare, what is the final verdict? Which epic finale actually reigns supreme?
The conclusion we must draw is brilliantly nuanced. It breaks the verdict down into two distinct realms of cinematic achievement. First, looking at the films critically, technically, and structurally.
The mechanics.
Right. If we are judging based purely on the mechanics of filmmaking, the sheer scale of the logistical production, the depth of the dramatic acting required to ground such outlandish fantasy, the revolutionary use of special effects, and the overwhelming, almost terrifying narrative ambition required to adapt Tolkien, the conclusion is that The Return of the King is fundamentally the stronger piece of cinema. It is a structural and technical marvel that was recognized as such by the highest echelons of film criticism.
But, and this is a massive but, if we shift the lens and judge based on emotional, visceral, and cultural resonance, if we're looking at the power of mythic simplicity, those truly iconic, immediately recognizable character moments that get permanently burned into our collective global memory, and the enduring cross-generational power of a pure redemption story, Return of the Jedi might actually hit harder for a broader swath of humanity.
It has a more universal emotional hook.
Emotionally, the raw simplicity of a son refusing to kill his father and a father sacrificing himself to save his son cuts through the noise of the special effects in a way that is incredibly, undeniably potent.
And that leads to what I consider the real answer to this entire debate, which is a perfect synthesis of this deep dive. One is the ultimate, unrivaled fantasy war epic. The other is the ultimate defining redemption space opera. They are the absolute pinnacle, the high watermarks of their respective, highly specific subgenres.
And I completely agree with that sentiment. We are ridiculously, unimaginably lucky to live in a world where both of these cinematic achievements exist. We don't actually have to choose one to wipe from existence. We get to watch both of them, study both of them, and be moved by both of them whenever we want. So what does this all mean for you, the listener?
It ultimately poses a direct question to you to determine where your personal, cinematic, and emotional allegiances lie. Are you bowing down to Aragorn at the gates of Minas Tirith? Or are you watching Darth Vader lift the Emperor and throw him down a reactor shaft for the 1,000th time?
It's a great question.
It is a fundamental question of aesthetic and emotional preference. Do you prefer the solemn, majestic, deeply earned reward of a grueling, traumatic journey finally completed? Or the thrilling, explosive, cheer-inducing catharsis of a sudden, unexpected redemptive act?
Exactly. Either way, the Force and Middle-earth are incredibly strong with you. It's a win-win situation for anyone who truly loves the magic of movies. But before we officially wrap up this deep dive, I want to leave you with one final, slightly provocative thought to mull over, something that builds on everything we have just spent the last hour dissecting.
I love a good thought experiment.
Both of these monumental films, The Return of the King and Return of the Jedi, are celebrated and revered primarily because they are epic finales. They took these massive, sweeping, multi-year, multi-character stories and brought them to a definitive, resonant, emotionally exhausting close.
True endings.
Right. The screen faded to black, the credits rolled, and you knew deep in your bones that the journey was over. The book was closed. But I want you to think about the media landscape we live in right now, today. In this current era of endless cinematic universes, interconnected multiverses, constant spin-offs, prequels, and legacy sequels, we really have to ask ourselves a difficult question.
Have we lost the finale?
Have we fundamentally lost the art of the finale? Is it even conceptually possible for a modern blockbuster to have the incredible cultural and emotional weight of a Return of the King or a Return of the Jedi if the audience knows, in the back of their minds, that the franchise is just going to reboot, or the characters are going to return in a streaming spinoff in 3 years?
It definitely changes the stakes.
Does knowing that a highly profitable intellectual property will never truly end actively rob us of the profound, lasting magic of a perfect conclusion? Keep exploring that idea. Keep questioning what makes an ending truly stick with you. And as always, keep diving